In 2004, there was a study published by Westat Corporation, and this is a rather expensive and extensive study. It cost the government about $43 million. And Westat was contracted by the government to collect data from 1999 through 2004 to measure the effectiveness of anti-marijuana ads. The United States government, it's estimated, has spent more than $1.4 billion between 1998 and around 2006 on ads that have been primarily designed to dissuade teens from using pot. And so after this comprehensive study done by Westat to look at the effectiveness of these ads, what they found was, it was quite interesting. They found that these ads actually increased the likelihood that kids would use marijuana. Right? The greater exposure to these ads, kids who'd been exposed to more ads as exposed to fewer of these ads, were more likely to have tried marijuana than kids who had been exposed to fewer of these ads. Right, so the greater the exposure to these ads, the more likely a child was or teen was to have tried marijuana. In addition, they found that greater exposure to anti-marijuana ads was associated with weaker anti-drug norms and increases in the perceptions that others use marijuana. And so this likelihood of, or greater likelihood of using pot or having tried pot is largely associated with these last two things, that people who'd seen more ads were more likely to have weaker anti-drug norms, and also a perception that, greater perception that kids or others are using marijuana. And so what's interesting here is that the data, the best data that we have, suggests that rather than being effective, these ads are ineffective, and actually not just in terms of having no effect on drug use, but actually might be associated with an increase in the likelihood of kids of having tried marijuana. Now, the government had this data for about a year and a half. They received it in 2005 and sort of sat on this data for about a year and a half. And when they were eventually forced to admit the fact that this data had been in the government's hands for this long period of time, while at the same time the government spent another $220 million on these ads, the government argued at the time that the data really shouldn't be, aren't really legitimate anymore, because they're about 2 years old. So it's really interesting that the government had this data. The government then continued to spend another $200 million on these ads while they had data that suggested that these ads are not working, but in fact have maybe a negative impact. And then the government went ahead and sort of like didn't acknowledge this study, but when they did, they argued that the data were really about 2 years old and maybe they therefore weren't that valid. Now, it's possible that there were changes made in the ads that had happened over the last couple of years and maybe that these new ads would be more effective, but that's something that is quite speculative at best, and it's something, of course, that could be studied, but there's no definitive proof that these newer ads are any more effective than the ads that were being aired over this 5 or 6 year period during which Westat collected data. Relatedly, I want to note that there have been several studies that have measured the effectiveness and have evaluated DARE programs. And what these studies have consistently found is that DARE programs are not effective in keeping kids from using drugs. Kids who have attended or participated in DARE programs are just as likely to eventually try or use drugs as children who have not been exposed to DARE programs. And like I said, there have been several studies that have found this. The results have been consistent, that DARE programs are not effective in reducing the likelihood that kids will use drugs. Now, one thing that has been shown, however, in some of these studies is that kids or children who have participated in DARE programs have a more favorable view of the police than children who have not participated in DARE programs. The Controlled Substances Act was passed by Congress in 1970. And the Controlled Substances Act came up with, in this act, Congress established 5 categories or schedules into which drugs would be classified. Marijuana has been placed in Schedule 1. It's listed as a Schedule 1 drug. And the criteria that are supposed to be used for determining that something is a Schedule 1 as opposed to a 2, 3, or 4, or 5 drug are the following. Let me say it that way. First of all, and these should be indented, I guess, to make it clear, Schedule 1 drugs are supposed to have a high potential for abuse. They are, second, supposed to have no currently accepted medical use in the United States. And third, drugs that are Schedule 1 are supposed to have a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision. Now, Schedule 1 includes drugs like heroin and cocaine and methamphetamine and ecstasy. These are all Schedule 1 drugs. Marijuana is classified in the same category as all these other hard drugs. Now, many people would argue that today, especially, some people question whether marijuana should ever have been classified as a Schedule 1 drug in terms of using these criteria. Many people, of course, today would argue that these things do not apply to marijuana, that it doesn't have a high potential for abuse, that there are accepted medical uses for it in the United States, and that many people believe that it could be used safely under medical supervision. Minimally,